We are concerned because it does have an impact on revenue. And at the current crude oil price of 53% is below the budget benchmarks. So what we're doing is we're studying the situation, and when the budget was passed, we committed to doing a midterm review. So when we do the midterm review, if the revenues are so significantly affected, we will have to do some revisions in the budget by way of budget adjustment. But I also want to inform this meeting that the crude oil production is now at 2 million barrels per day, and in some days it has even moved up to 2.1 million barrels per day. So that in itself would be a cushion, but all the same, we are not taking any measures now until we have a reasonable period within which we make a review, and then we may need to do an adjustment to the budget through working together with the National Assembly.
We start off our conversation this morning with a look at the economy, particularly the FG's plans to get another $22.7 billion loan, among other issues. And how much of a concern should this be to us? How does this help us or hurt us? These are many issues that giving a number of people serious concern on the front pages of the newspapers this morning. You also saw the OPS, Organized Private Sector, is a little bit worried. And one of them is here to have this conversation with us. Bayo Rotimi is a financial consultant and economist. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
A pleasure to be here.
Should we be worried, really?
I believe we should.
But you economists also tell us that there's nothing wrong with a little debt here and there.
A little debt here and there is a good thing. But when it becomes unsustainable, then it becomes a threat, it becomes a major risk factor.
What makes it unsustainable?
Well, when you go borrowing, the expectation is that the debt must be repaid. So you must have clarity around your revenue sources, because it is ultimately those revenue sources that you will use to service the debt. Now, if you go by our history as a nation, in the last 10, 20 years, we have always consistently fallen short of our revenue targets. So we are spending money that we really cannot afford to spend. So there is a significant gap between what we spend and what we earn, which creates a deficit. We then go and borrow to plug the deficit. So we are always very good in the expenditure part of our budgeting. You will see that performance on the expenditure budget is always averaging 85–90%. Performance on the revenue side, we then start to see 40, 50, 60% if we're lucky. So we go the shortcut, which is to borrow to plug the gap, rather than revisit the fundamental issues for the dysfunction.
So we find ourselves in a situation where, we have a population of 200 million people. There's a large need for, infrastructural development, from roads to hospital. I can go on and on. And people will say we've not been performing well when it comes to revenue, perhaps as a result of the dwindling crude prices, which is a major, the major thing we rely on for revenue. And also the fact that we don't even have some of this, infrastructure in place, roads, for example. to improve the industrial revolution that we're looking forward to. So here's my point. The president has said this borrowing is tied to key projects, which they say is quite different from what we have in the past. So looking at that, and I'm going to reel out those projects, but looking at the fact that they are tied to projects, does that not change the dynamics for you?
I disagree. If you go into our history of borrowing, the reasons have always been the same. We've always said we want to borrow to fund our infrastructure. The reality is this, Kayode, the Nigerian government cannot meet all of its infrastructure needs. It cannot fund it either through its own internally generated revenues, neither should it attempt to fund it through this wholesale borrowing, right? What is required is a greater participation with the private sector. Let me give you a simple example. The last time I checked, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway was to cost 134 billion naira.
Right.
You're using 134 billion naira to build 120 odd kilometers of roads, right? It doesn't sound right to me. That is such a major artery, right? That is a prime candidate for a concession. So what government needs to do is to be more creative in its approach to solving the infrastructure deficit. Attempting to fund infrastructure directly from your revenues or by borrowing is a challenge. Because not all of those infrastructure projects can be configured in such a way as to generate revenues to service the debt. So I don't have a problem if you are borrowing for specific projects that will be run on a commercial basis, and the revenues generated therefrom will take out the debt.
I remember the Minister of Transport recently had him on the program, and he tried to say, when we have the rail, for example, working, this will build up. It will have a ripple effect on the economy. But the point is, when you say that the government needs to partner more with the private sector, are you saying that this $22.7 billion can be gotten in quote from the private sector?
Easily. The private sector has what they call a profit orientation. So they will take on a project, an infrastructure project, if they see that there is a reasonable estimation, or if they see a reasonable probability of them making profits. So that is why I mentioned a concession. So Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, let's assume private sector partner was building that road. I dare say it may not cost 134 billion, because they will probably be a lot more efficient in their processes. Now, you give them a 20, 25, 30-year concession to toll the road, to recover their investment, and also make a little profit. Yeah? You as government, you provide oversight. You watch them, you hold them to account, you sanction them when they step out of line or they do not meet agreed objectives. The role of government is supposed to be an enabler rather than an active participant, especially when history has shown us, 60-year history, that we have never been efficient being front and center or in infrastructure projects. From local government to state government to federal government, our record is atrocious. And I dare say it is not about to change.
But, this concession you made, while it sounds like a good idea, a number of people will look at our history when it comes to concessions. One is the Lekki concession, which many people have cried a lot about, and I don't know if, so if we look at that history and we look at the possibility of having that kind of conversation, do you think it is something people will be open to?
Every system that is devoid of rules, or rather, if the rules exist and the application of the rules is faulty, then any initiative will falter. Concessioning in itself works all over the world. It works in emerging markets like Nigeria. It works in Kenya. It works in Rwanda. It works in Botswana. It works in Ghana. So there is nothing faulty about concession. Neither is there anything faulty about privatization.
Okay.
What the problem we have always had is that we do not strictly implement, we do not strictly supervise, we do not select the best people to do these things. So you mentioned a particular concession now. Some people have mentioned the power privatization. There is nothing wrong with privatization, but you must go back to the process. Was it the right process? Did we get the right core investors for these power assets? So let us follow the rules and you will see a different result.
So what are the rules that may have been broken or that we need to pay attention to if government is to toe this line?
For this thing to work, every time you go into a concession type agreement or a privatization type arrangement, there are 2 or 3 cardinal things that government must focus on. The prospective concessionaire or bidder for a national asset must have the requisite technical, financial, and managerial capacity. They must have a verifiable track record of all of these things. It is on the basis of that that you can you can pre-qualify somebody and select them as concessionaire or core investor. So the challenges we've always had, particularly with power privatization, is that those who emerged as preferred bidders unfortunately did not have the financial capacity, neither did they have the technical or managerial capacity to run these businesses well. In fairness to them, to some extent, government also was not consistent in the application of the rules around that sector. So let us have sectoral reform and let government be true to implementation. And you will see a lot of private capital come in and help bridge this gap.
You know, speaking of bridge, part of the projects, the legacy projects to be implemented by this loan is the second Niger Bridge, the East-West Road, the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, the Mambila Power Project, and the Kaduna-Abuja Highway. The President also spoke about, you know, projects that will boost agriculture, health, education, water supply growth, and employment generation. So, yes, you have suggested another way to go about this, but seeing the end product, don't you think it kind of justifies the means?
I can only work on the basis of historical evidence. Historical evidence has shown me that in 60 years of governance in Nigeria, government has consistently failed to deliver on promises, be they infrastructure, be they reform, be they political.
Why?
Now, I will say we're going into the realm of politics here, but my sense is this. If government does not feel accountable to the people, then they will do what they like.
Forgive me, Mr. Rotimi.
Yes.
I think there are some really serious fundamental issues that need to be that you may need to raise here. Government is a continuum. So whatever errors a government commits, the successive government has to bear the burden.
Right.
And that is what you are referring to now has happened over the years, such that one government comes in, tries to redress and all of that. For instance, it was in the government of Obasanjo when it came, that all these toll gates were removed, from our, major highways because of the problem of, corruption and all of that. So what are the fundamentals that need to be erected? Because without these fundamentals, I don't see how OPS can do well.
It is a tricky question, or answering, there is no clear-cut answer to that particular question because it is dependent on multiple variables. I mentioned the people holding their governments accountable. Another factor is, do the right people get into political office? The people that get there, do they have the capacity to run government the way it should be? My sense is this: with every successive administration that we have in this country, we have an opportunity to press the reset button and try to do things differently. Governance, as you said, is a continuum, but a government that comes in should seek to remedy the mistakes of the past, should seek to learn from the mistakes of the past. In reality, what we are seeing is a repetition of historical mistakes, and we keep wondering why we keep getting the same results. So that is why I am advocating today that the solution has to be different. another 23 odd billion dollars of borrowing. It takes our national debt to in excess of almost 110 billion dollars. That is definitely not the way to go.
But, you know, a number of people might say, I don't know how much that is, because, I mean, there are a number of countries that, for instance, Japan,
Yes.
it has a 237.7% debt to GDP ratio. United States has 106.2% debt to GDP ratio.
Good.
Where are we? And of course, the
Again,
World Bank says
yes.
77%
Yes.
is the tipping point.
Good. So again, we tend to be selective in our use of statistics. So debt to GDP ratio, we're well below that threshold, that tipping point. But debt service to revenue, the cost of actually repaying the principal sum and the interest element of that debt, in the last 4 years, it has averaged nothing less than 60%. So for every 100 naira we earn as a nation, 60% of 60 naira of it immediately goes to service debt. Where is the money required to fund this infrastructure you are talking about? So we have entered into a debt trap. Nigeria was in a debt trap. We got out of it during the Obasanjo regime. Now we've gone headlong, bang, dead center into another debt trap. And it's a vicious cycle, you know, because you skip. So ultimately what will happen now is that we are going to be borrowing money to repay debt.
So leaning on that,
Yes.
that analogy
Yes.
you gave, so if we're making 100, for example,
Yes.
and we have to use 60 to service our debts, we have only 40 available to
Right.
us. So what if we invest in making more? So we make 200, 120, and we have 80 to us. Does that not make more sense?
Now, you know, and I'll link it to Ayo's initial question. You know, debt in itself, in theory, as long as your revenues can support it, your cash flows can support it, it's not a bad thing. The challenge is, number one, what do you use the debt for? How efficiently do you utilize it? What economic value is created as a result of that borrowing? So Japan you mentioned, the US you mentioned, you can see clearly where the debt that they have taken has been channeled into. You can see their infrastructure. You can see unemployment at less than US unemployment is about 3%. So you can see where debt properly utilized can catalyze economic growth. But debt that is poorly utilized will only create a debt trap. Because what it means is, ordinarily, like you said, if we build a railway system, like you mentioned, the minister mentioned, ultimately economic activity should be created, employment should be created. But we've done a Abuja Kaduna Railway. Ask the minister, is that project, if it were run on a commercial basis, is that project sustainable? Is it covering its costs? It is not, because we are not running it on a commercial basis. And I dare say it is very likely that these new borrowings that will go into these new projects, they are going into projects I call social infrastructure, which is good. But what we need now is the kind of investment in infrastructure that can generate the cash flows to service the specific debt.
You know, which still kind of goes back to what the minister says. He said vehemently that, this is not exactly to make profit. It's meant to improve economic activities,
That's
which you
the
have
problem
said.
I have with that statement.
Interestingly. But then let's take a look at this. It would seem as though, from the statements you are making, you are predicting that this will fail, and it hasn't even started yet.
Kayode, I am a student of history. They say that we should learn from history to avoid repeating the mistakes. Everything we have done, I am working on the basis of evidence. So evidence in the last 4 years. So let us not isolate this or streamline this and focus on current administration, because you can say maybe I am unfair because I'm lumping everybody together. So work with current evidence. what was our debt profile in 2015, what is our debt profile today. All of the debt that has been taken, what has been the economic impact of that debt? How efficiently have the projects that the proceeds of that debt have been deployed to, how efficiently have those projects been managed? How many of them have been completed? That is the challenge. So I am working on the basis of evidence.
Right. Some will also, take you up and say, well, we had some indices telling us that the economy grew better than, was predicted.
Now, I will debunk those statements. And I will work on the basis of facts. We have an economic recovery and growth plan, a 3-year plan to span 2017 to 2020. It is the economic blueprint of this administration. And as we came out of recession, 2016 recession, this was what was supposed to be the roadmap to lead Nigeria towards economic sustainability. GDP target for 2018 in the ARGP was 4.8%. 2019, it was 4.5%. 2020, it is supposed to be 7%. 2018 actual, 1.94. 2019 actual, 2.3. 2020, we cannot. I am not a messenger of doom, but there is no way, based on current evidence, that we will deliver 7% GDP growth. Go and look at all the targets inside the ERGP. Put them side by side. How many of them have we delivered on?
So what then do we need to do in order to make this, work? Because clearly, the Senate has approved, despite all of the opposition, some other quarters, the Senate has approved that the federal government can go ahead and take the $22.7 billion loan.
Yes.
What do we need to do as a people? You have talked about the debt stock and how that it has risen, and we're having a problem of, the debt trap, you called it. What do we need to do to make this work? Because we can't lay it only at the feet of government. There is not. This country is owned by about 200 million people.
Yes, and that is why I am here today, and that is why every Nigerian should become an activist. That is why every Nigerian must hold government accountable. If we see government leading us onto a path that will adversely impact our present and future, then we have a right. We must speak up, and that is really the issue. So the question is this: the Senate has approved 22-point-something billion, right? The federal government, the executive arm of government, must really, really ask themselves some questions. Do I want to draw down, for example, on the entire 22.7 or whatever that figure is, right? Then the portion that I want to draw down, why don't I tie it to specific projects that will generate cash flow? So it's not enough to say I will complete Lagos Ibadan, I will do second Niger Bridge and this and this. Let them show the Nigerian people that on a project-by-project basis, they have done the cash flow analysis, that I borrow 5 billion for this particular project. This project over 20 years will recover the 5 billion. It will even start adding surplus to the national treasury. So take each project on a case-by-case basis. And I will say channel this new debt to only the most economically viable
Are you saying
projects.
the government should not build roads, railway?
I am saying that using debt. I am saying that when you are using other people's money to fund key infrastructure projects, invest the proceeds of that debt in projects that will generate the cash flows to allow you to pay back the debt. Because however concessionary the debt is, it must be repaid.
Part of what this loan is about, from the data and information that Kade has, reeled out, which of course is in public domain,
correct,
is that this loan will help to generate employment. How do you see that happening?
Ayo, our bane as a nation is implementation. We talk a good game. The ARGP, read that document. It is first class. It is the product of first class Nigerian minds. So we have the intellect. We have the capacity.
So what's the
what
problem?
we lack is the discipline to implement. That's all.
Just-
the discipline to implement
Just to be-
because of ulterior personal benefits.
Whose responsibility is it?
All of us, because it will be
you
wrong
know-
to point to only government, even though they are supposed to be our elected
You know that
representatives.
everybody's job is nobody's job.
Yes.
So you have said that Nigerians should hold government to account.
Yes.
Some specifics might help.
Okay. We have 3 arms of government, right? Everybody in government today, outside of the judiciary, was elected by the people of Nigeria. So it means that Nigerians must say, at the end of every 4-year cycle, have my elected representatives, have they represented me properly? What policies and programs have they rolled out that has impacted on my life and my well-being? That is the question. But the problem is this. If you have almost 100 million Nigerians in abject poverty, it means that you have 100 million Nigerians who have no voice, who are really susceptible to whoever dishes out some money in the run-up to an election. So unfortunately, our system is flawed.
Right.
So it is what it is. So I will then say, the people who are seated there today as our elected representatives, let us continually call them out. When we feel they step out of line, let us talk. We supposedly have a Freedom of Information Bill which should give us access to information.
Absolutely.
So we are demanding for information. Don't tell me I want to do Second Niger Bridge or Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. Lagos-Ibadan Expressway has been under construction for 10 years.
You know, the interesting part is, I'd like to take you up, when we return from the break, on the expectations of the Nigerians out there. Because the expectations are one thing. I mean, the business community, your expectation is another thing. I mean, you want to make profit. The people out there, I mean, they want roads, they want power.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to connect this when we return from the break.
Absolutely. So please stay with us.
He who goes a borrowing goes a sorrowing.
The Senate Minority Leader making his feelings known on the plans by the executive to borrow the sum of $22.7 billion as contained in the 2016 to 2018 federal government external borrowing plan. President Buhari sent the external borrowing plan to the Senate for approval, and the chairman of the Committee on Loans is presenting the report on the president's request before the Senate. Out of a total borrowing request of $22.7 billion, a sum of $17.065 billion is to be borrowed from the China Exim Bank to cover road, rail, electricity and water projects, as well as the NTA digitalization project, agriculture, health and education projects, among others.
The committee notes that this loan request includes programs which continue to pursue the need for a social safety net for the poor, vulnerable, and needy among our population.
It's time for lawmakers to vote either to support the loan or not. But the Senate Minority Leader is not comfortable with the procedure.
The reason why they put it, this is for the power sector, this is for the road sector, this is for the rest, is so that we can look at it individually. So, will we not look at it?
Our committee had worked on this. They have recommended certain things. What we vote on is the recommendation of the committee, and they are itemized on the report. So when we vote, you could decide to vote against everything.
We who are going to pay back, that are making efforts to make sure that this is clarified to other people. And Mr. President, you are not giving us the privilege to make our points known and come across.
I don't want the discussion on this loan to degenerate into partisanship.
I would appeal to you to allow us go to an executive session for 10 minutes.
About 45 minutes later, the closed-door session ends and the Senate approves the external borrowing request of $22.7 billion.
Thank you very much. Leader of the Senate.
However, there is still apprehension about the debt service to revenue ratio, which remains higher than desirable. Linda Akibi, Channels Television News.
Sabaya Rotimi is still with us, financial consultant and economist. You want to take on that question that Kade asked you earlier?
But before then, I mean, you saw what just played out
Yes.
at the Senate. The fact that, it seemed as though some agreed that this is what we want to do. And you heard Senator Barbie there saying that, I mean, we need to break this down into details. And we saw that happen during the 8th Assembly. In fact, just about $6 billion of the original request was approved. So how do you think we should have gone about this? I know this is not something you agree with, but seeing that this is the way we're going, do you think we should have gone about it in bits and pieces maybe, or as a whole?
I think definitely it should have been broken down. I think the clip we saw now, there was some question about, can we examine almost on a sector by sector basis? You want to vote X amount to the power sector. Can we interrogate that? You want to vote X amount to roads. Can we look at that? My view is that that should have been done, but nonetheless, it has been passed now. So going forward, what are the ways? I think it is critical to have a value for money conversation before we start to draw down on those things. Be specific about the project you want to put the proceeds into. Be sure that those projects can generate the cash flows to service that debt. Number 2. Number 3, I will even say, before we seek to draw down significantly, one recurring issue has always been how efficiently has government been managing even the meager resources that are available. So you then must look at the expenditure side of our budget, because everybody seems to be focused on the revenue shortfalls and the need to borrow to plug those shortfalls. But what about the revenue, where between recurrent and statutory transfers in excess of 5 trillion naira will be expended by the public sector infrastructure in Nigeria? Now, of a estimated revenue of 8 trillion, that's easily 60% of our revenues. So we take a big hit with regard to debt service. Whatever is left there goes into recurrent expenditure. That is why we are left with no other option but to go and borrow to attempt to fund capital expenditure. So you see why we are in this sorry pass.
One other thing that perhaps has been worrisome for the federal government, the executive and legislature, has been this hydra-headed individual called corruption. We've seen,
Corruption as an individual?
Oh, well, yes, of course. We just saw on the front page of one of the papers this morning a report from the House of Representatives alleges some $30 billion revenue leakage. That's just one that they have seen. We have seen successive reports of the Auditor General, reporting that there are leakages, or there are unremitted funds, or there are officers that need to be to answer some questions. How do you think this could have helped if the proper things were done to block some of these leakages and all?
At some point, it's like I'm sounding like a broken record because I say this thing so often. I mentioned earlier 2020 budget, 5 trillion naira recurrent, which is salaries, wages, and overheads for the government infrastructure, ministries, departments, and agencies of government. That cost is unsustainable. So rather than focusing on borrowing money, we should be focused on how can we introduce efficiency to remove the leakages you talked about. How do we institute greater transparency to ensure that agencies of government who are not as open as they should be with their contribution to the central pot? Why do we have today, 60 years later, an NNPC that is still as opaque as it was 60 years ago? NNPC is almost a government unto itself. Why don't we open it up? Why don't we break it up? Why don't we allow greater accountability and transparency? I dare say, if there is a focus, if that is the singular focus of this administration for the remainder of its tenure, that we walk away in 2023 boasting that we have reduced recurrent expenditure, the cost of governance, by 40%, and we have redirected that 40% savings into infrastructure, that will remove the need to borrow.
It sounds like you have a list of areas we should look into. So NNPC is on top of that list. Which other areas can we look into?
Now, the NNPC, my sense is this. The oil economy is the largest contributor to our revenues, particularly foreign exchange revenues. So I think that is somewhere to look at. The Customs Service, they have done well. You know, year on year, their numbers increase revenue generation. I think with greater automation, they can do very well. The shipping industry, there are significant billions of dollars in untapped revenue in the maritime sector as a whole. There are a lot of leakages. Aviation, the foreign airlines that come into Nigeria, Nigeria is their preferred destination because the kind of margins they make out of operating a Nigerian route, they don't make elsewhere. So there are several pockets of either leakages or underreporting. Even our crude oil production, 2.1 million, the minister said 2 million, 2.1. Have we interrogated it? How much crude oil is lost, siphoned from the pipelines every day?
You know, I want you to do this in about a minute. That question you were going to answer. So how do we draw the line? The people want roads, they want power, they want these basic amenities. But then you are coming from the angle that, yes, we need to provide these things, but we need to ensure we make profit or at least generate revenue from it. So how do we balance that?
Well, it is not to generate revenue in itself for profit reasons. It is to be able to ensure sustainability. Because every time government builds infrastructure, you must then appropriate for it every subsequent year for maintenance. I'm saying move that off the government balance sheet. Let it be somebody else's headache. You be the supervisor of that person. You sanction that person if that person fails to deliver. You sack that person and replace that person if they fail to deliver. I am saying that government is carrying a lot of things. It has neither the capacity nor the willingness nor the ability to manage.
And the private sector does not mind that headache.
Oh, the private sector is built to handle the headache.
Fantastic.
And of course, the private sector is worried about getting this loan right now. And we'll have to thank you very much for being a part of our conversation this morning. Rotimi is a financial consultant and economist. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. We're back in a moment. Please stay with us.